The rattlesnake was the least of their problems. Cord Halsey heard it before he saw it. That dry, papery shake coming from the creosote bush 2 feet to his left, and he pulled his 9-year-old son Fen backward by the collar without thinking, the way a father does when the body acts before the mind catches up. The snake slid off the rock and was gone into the brush. Fen didn't make a sound. That was the thing about Fen. The boy had learned early that silence in the desert was not rudeness. It was survival. Behind them on the trail, Cord's younger brother Dale was already checking the sky. That was bad. Dale only checked the sky when he'd heard something in it that he didn't want to name out loud. The Superstition Mountains in August were not a place a man chose to be. They were a place a man ended up when his choices had run out. Cord had not planned to be here. 3 days ago, he had been leading a government survey team out of Mesa through the lower Sonoran Desert. 7 men with mules, transit equipment, and 6 weeks of supplies, mapping water sources for a proposed rail corridor. Then the team's senior surveyor had taken a fever on the 2nd night, and by morning, 2 more men had it. And by the time Cord understood what was moving through the camp, 4 of the 7 were down, and the remaining 3, Cord, Dale, and a Tohono O'odham tracker named Sewa, who had worked government contracts for 11 years and trusted almost nobody, had taken the boy and the essential equipment and moved upslope to get clear of whatever was in the water. They had not come down since. Fen was Cord's son from his first marriage, a quiet, a watchful child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's habit of studying a problem from 3 angles before speaking. He had been on survey work with his father twice before and knew how to pack a mule, how to read a compass bearing, and how to be useful without being asked. He did not know, yet, that the men they had left in the lower camp were probably dead. Cord intended to keep it that way until there was a better moment, which in the Superstition wilderness in August might never come. The sky Dale was reading had gone the color of an old bruise, greenish-purple at the horizon, the clouds building in columns to the southwest that Cord had seen before in this country. Monsoon, the summer storms that came up from the Gulf of Mexico and hit the mountain ranges of Arizona territory like a thrown fist, yet dropping more water in 2 hours than some eastern cities saw in a month. In the canyon systems of the Superstitions, a monsoon storm didn't just mean rain. It meant walls of water coming down draws that had been bone dry an hour before, carrying everything: boulders, uprooted scrub, the bones of things that hadn't moved fast enough. They were in a draw right now. Sewa had already seen it. He was moving before Cord gave any instruction, pushing past the creosote bush where the snake had been, heading for the canyon wall to the east, where a band of volcanic rock jutted from the sandstone in a dark horizontal shelf 30 feet above the canyon floor. He moved without urgency and without wasted motion, the way a man moves when he has been reading desert terrain his whole life, and his body has absorbed the grammar of it completely. "How long?" Cord called after him. Sewa held up 2 fingers without turning around. 2 hours, maybe less. Cord looked at Dale. Dale was 31, 6 years younger, built like their father had been, wide through the shoulders, short in the leg, capable of carrying absurd weight over bad ground without complaint. He had a gash on his left forearm from a scramble over basalt 2 days ago, wrapped in torn shirt linen that was holding but not prettily. He was looking at the shelf Sewa was moving toward and doing the same arithmetic Cord was doing. "We can make that," Dale said. "We have to make that," Cord said. Fen was already moving. He had watched Sewa go and followed without being told, his small pack bouncing on his shoulders, his boots finding the same foothold Sewa had used. But Cord felt the particular tightness in his chest that came with watching his son move through dangerous terrain. Not fear exactly, because fear was too simple a word for it. Something older than fear. Something that had no name in any language he knew. They had 2 canteens between 4 people, 11 strips of dried beef, a compass, a coil of half-inch rope, a geological survey map that showed the canyon systems accurately, but said nothing useful about what was in them, and a single-shot Springfield rifle that Cord carried more out of habit than hope, given that the most dangerous thing in the Superstitions was not anything with teeth. It was the terrain itself. The shelf was 30 feet up, and the face below it was not a climb so much as a negotiation, broken volcanic rock studded with barrel cactus, at the handholds sharp enough to cut through gloves if they'd had gloves, which they did not. Sewa reached it first and turned back to help Fen, reaching down with one long arm and gripping the boy's wrist as Fen scrambled the last 6 feet on friction and determination. Dale went next. Cord came last, pausing at the base of the face to look back down the draw. The sound reached him before the water did. It wasn't a roar. People who had never heard a desert flash flood expected a roar. What it actually sounded like, at distance, was a low, sustained hiss, the sound of an enormous volume of moving air being pushed ahead of the water, the canyon breathing out before the flood arrived. Then came the smell. Wet earth and crushed vegetation, and something mineral and ancient, the smell of the mountain being rearranged. Cord climbed. When he climbed the way a man climbs when he is not thinking about the climbing, when the only thought in his mind is the shelf above and the boy already on it. His right hand found a knob of basalt. His left found a crack. His boot smeared against the face and held. At 20 feet, he felt the first drops of rain, fat and hard as thrown pebbles, cold against the back of his neck. At 25 feet, the hiss became something larger. At 28 feet, Dale grabbed his wrist and pulled. He came over the lip of the shelf and rolled onto his back just as the flood took the draw below them. It was not a wall of water. It was more total than that. The entire floor of the canyon became water, instantly, as though the desert had simply decided to be a river. Red and brown and churning, moving fast enough to roll boulders, but fast enough to tear a creosote bush out by its roots and carry it spinning downstream like a child's toy. The noise was enormous. Fen pressed against Cord's side, and Cord put his arm around the boy and held him, and watched the canyon floor disappear. The shelf was dry. Barely, but dry. All 4 of them were on it. Cord looked at Sewa. Sewa looked back at him with the expression of a man who has been correct about a dangerous thing and finds no satisfaction in it. "How long does it run?" Cord asked. Sewa looked at the sky. The rain was coming hard now, drumming on the volcanic shelf, bouncing off the rock in a fine mist. The draw below was full bank to bank, moving like a locomotive. "Until it stops," Sewa said. Fen looked up at his father. There was no panic in the boy's face, but there was something else. The look of a child who has decided to be as steady as the adults around him, whether or not the adults around him deserve it. Cord pulled him closer. They were alive. They were 30 feet above a flash flood on a shelf of volcanic rock in the Superstition wilderness, with a storm building above them, 2 hours of light left in the sky, and no way down until the water dropped. But they were alive. That was the start of something. He didn't know yet what. The rain stopped before the water did. That was the Superstition's particular cruelty. The storm would pass in an hour and leave the canyons running hard for 6 more, draining the entire mountain range through whatever channels it could find. The shelf they sat on was 12 feet deep and 40 feet wide, generous by the standards of what this country usually offered. Sewa had found a crack in the back wall that funneled rainwater into a natural basin, worn into the rock surface, wide as a wash basin, already filling. He directed Fen to hold both canteens under the trickle while he checked the basin edges for contamination, mineral staining, insect deposits, anything that would make the water a problem rather than a solution. He checked it the way he checked everything, thoroughly, without commentary, without any performance of expertise. "Good water," he said, and Fen filled both canteens to the top. Dale had his back against the canyon wall, his injured arm resting across his knee, and watching the flood below with the meditative expression of a man who has decided that worrying about something he cannot change is a waste of fuel he doesn't have to spare. The gash on his forearm was seeping again through the linen wrap. Cord unwound it, cleaned the wound as well as he could with a corner of wet cloth, and rewrapped it tighter. Dale accepted this without complaint and without thanks, which was the language the two of them had always used with each other. Practical, unadorned, built on 20 years of working the same difficult ground. "Survey map," Dale said when Cord was done. Cord pulled it from the oilskin sleeve in his pack and spread it on the rock between them. The Superstition wilderness was rendered in the careful lines of a government cartographer who had, Cord suspected, never actually walked the terrain he was drawing. Canyon systems were marked, but their depths were not. Water sources were noted, but not their reliability in August. The shelf they were on did not exist on the map at all, which was either because the cartographer had missed it or because volcanic intrusions of this kind were too numerous and too small to bother with. What the map did show clearly was the canyon system's exit point, a wide wash called Tortilla Flat that opened onto the lower desert 4 miles to the southwest. 4 miles was nothing in flat country. In the Superstitions, in August, after a monsoon, with a 9-year-old and a man with a gashed arm, 4 miles was a serious proposition. Sewa studied the map for a long moment, yet he had the cartographer's lines memorized inside 30 seconds. Cord could tell by the way his eyes stopped moving. Then he put his finger on a point roughly 1.5 miles from their current position. "Secondary canyon here," he said. "Runs northwest. Shorter to the flat, but the walls are steep." "How steep?" Cord said. "I went through it once, 7 years ago. Dry season." "And now?" Sewa looked at the flood below. "Different canyon now." That was, Cord understood, not a refusal. It was an honest accounting of changed variables. Sewa did not deal in false confidence. It was the quality Cord trusted most in him and the quality that made other men who wanted to be told that everything would be fine, deeply uncomfortable in his presence. Fen had been listening. He was sitting cross-legged on the rock, both canteens in his lap, and looking at the map upside down from across the spread. "What's this mark?" he said, and pointed. Cord looked. At the head of the secondary canyon Sewa had indicated, the cartographer had made a small notation in pencil, not a standard survey symbol, something added by hand, informal. A rough circle with a line through it. Cord had seen the mark before in government survey documents. It meant a known spring, confirmed by a previous party. He looked at Sewa. Sewa's expression shifted, not surprise, but the recalibration of a man adding new information to an existing calculation. "I didn't go that far into the canyon," he said. "I came back when the walls tightened. But if there's a spring at the head, there's a way through above the spring. Has to be. Water comes from somewhere above the canyon. Well, which means the rock opened somewhere above it. Sewa paused. Which means we have a route. It was the most words Cord had heard him string together in 3 days. Below them, the flood was dropping. Slowly, grudgingly, the way flood water always dropped in these canyons. In pulses, surging back up every 20 minutes as another drainage upstream contributed its load. Then dropping again, the general trend downward, but the path uneven. Cord estimated another 3 hours before the canyon floor was walkable. The light would be gone in 2. That meant moving in the dark for part of it. He looked at Fen. The boy was already rolling the map carefully, sliding it back into the oilskin sleeve, exactly as he'd watched his father do it 100 times. But he handed it back without being asked, and looked up at Cord with those dark eyes that saw more than a 9-year-old should have to see. "We're going through the secondary canyon," Fen said. It was not a question. "We are," Cord said. "At night." Part of it. Fen absorbed this, nodded once. "Okay." Dale pushed himself off the wall and rolled his shoulder, testing it, the way he always did before a hard push, an old habit from their survey days, checking the machinery before asking it to perform. He looked at the canyon below, the flood still churning rust red in the last of the light, and then at the shelf edge, and then at the route down that they would have to take when the water dropped enough to permit it. "I'll go first on the descent," Dale said. "Test the face." "Your arm is attached," Dale said. It'll hold." That was the end of that conversation. Sewa had moved to the far edge of the shelf and was looking southwest, reading the sky the way Cord had seen Tohono O'odham men read sky his entire career, not checking for weather, but reading the land's relationship to the light, the way shadows fell in the canyon systems, the angle of the remaining sun against the western walls. He was building a picture of the terrain they would cross in the dark before they crossed it. Cord left him to it. He sat beside Fen and handed the boy a strip of dried beef. Fen took it and chewed it slowly, and looked at the flood below with the patient attention of someone who has decided to be interested in the world rather than frightened of it. Cord had not taught him that. It had come from somewhere in the boy himself, or from his mother, or from some combination of the two that Cord would never fully understand. "Dad," Fen said. "Yeah." "The men in the lower camp." Cord was quiet for a moment. The flood below them made its noise. The last light was going orange on the western canyon wall. "They were sick," Cord said carefully. "I know," Fen said. "I'm not asking if they're okay." He paused. "I'm asking if we're going back for them. After." Cord looked at his son. The boy's face was steady and serious, and entirely without self-pity. He was asking a logistical question, not an emotional one. He was asking what the plan was. "After we get out," Cord said. "First thing." Fen nodded and finished the dried beef and said nothing more about it. The flood dropped another 8 inches in the next hour. Sewa came back from the shelf edge and crouched beside the map one more time and traced the route with his finger without touching the paper. An inch above it. The path already fixed in his mind. Dale was asleep against the wall, with his injured arm across his chest, his breathing slow and even, storing energy the way a practical man stores everything, quietly, without announcement, against future need. Cord watched the canyon darken and thought about the spring at the head of the secondary canyon, the circle with the line through it, the unknown man who had put it there. Some surveyor 3 years ago, 5 years ago, moving through this same broken country with a pencil and a purpose, leaving a mark that he could not have known would matter to 4 people on a shelf in a flood on an August night in 1887. Yet he was grateful for that unknown man. He was grateful, too, for the shelf, for the rain that had filled the basin, for the good water, for Sewa's eyes and Dale's shoulders, and his son's absolute refusal to be anything less than steady. The water dropped. The stars came out above the canyon walls, hard and close, the way they only are in desert country. It was time to move. They went down the canyon face in the dark with the rope. Dale first, as promised, his injured arm doing its job without complaint. Then Fen, Cord holding the rope above, while Sewa talked the boy down in a low, steady voice, one foothold at a time, never rushing, never making it sound like anything other than a manageable problem with a manageable solution. Fen's boots found the rock. He descended clean. The canyon floor was ankle-deep in fast-moving sediment. Not flood, and not anymore, but the flood's memory, the last inch of it draining southwest through the gravel. They walked in it for a quarter mile before it thinned to nothing, and the ground went solid under their boots. The secondary canyon entrance was where Sewa said it would be. The walls were tight, 8 feet across at the narrowest, the volcanic rock pressing in from both sides, the stars above reduced to a single crooked ribbon of sky. Cord kept one hand on the wall and one hand aware of Fen beside him. Dale moved well, despite the arm. Sewa led without hesitation, reading the canyon floor for debris, for drop-offs, for the soft ground that meant unstable footing, and finding the firm path through each time with the unhurried confidence of a man who has spent a lifetime in difficult country and made his peace with it. Yet they heard the spring before they saw it. That small, clean sound, water moving over rock in the dark, was the best sound Cord had heard in 3 days. Fen went to it at a near run and cupped water in both hands and drank and looked back at his father with an expression that needed no words. They filled the canteens. They rested 10 minutes. Then Sewa found the break in the canyon wall above the spring, a sloped ledge system rising to the northwest, exactly as he had predicted, the rock open and walkable. They climbed out of the superstitions as the sky ahead of them went from black to the deep blue that comes an hour before dawn. The lower desert opened below them, wide and pale and still. Tortilla Flat was visible in the gray pre-light, the wash cutting a familiar line through the scrub. Dale sat on a boulder at the rim and looked at his arm, and then at the sky, and exhaled slowly. Sewa stood at the edge and looked southwest and said nothing, which was how he marked moments that mattered. Fen stood beside his father and leaned against him, not out of exhaustion, but out of something simpler. The animal comfort of being close to someone you trust when the hard thing is finished. Cord put his hand on the boy's shoulder and held it there. Below them, 4 miles out, the world was waiting. They went down to meet it. If Cord, Fen, Dale, and Sewa's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. When Fen asked his father about the men in the lower camp, what do you think that moment said about the kind of man Cord was raising? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.